Senator Dodd, you spent 30 years serving as a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, following time in the House. Senator Santorum, you spent 12 years serving in the Senate, following time in the House as well. We're really excited to have you as co-chairs of the Task Force on Paid Family Leave. One thing we were joking about earlier is that it's not often that the conversation of paid family leave is led with men at the table, let alone co-chaired by a couple men up here. So we're really excited to have some gender diversity to the discussion today.
We have women on the task force.
That is true. That is true. But let me start by asking, gentlemen, you have two very differing political ideologies and backgrounds. Yet over the years, you've worked together in the Senate to forge partnerships that have led to meaningful and lasting legislation. Today, as part of the task force, you're exploring a bipartisan compromise on paid family leave. Will you each tell us a little bit about why you joined the task force and the work that we're doing?
Where do you want to go first?
You, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this.
Seniority.
First of all, thanks the Bipartisan Policy Commission for hosting this, as you have on so many other issues over the years. So thank you for bringing us together on this subject matter. We'll start there. And the issue of why being involved in it, well, as you point out, I was the author of the Family Medical Leave Act in the Senate, spent 9 years in the Senate to adopt that legislation. Pat Schroeder in the House, who never gets enough credit, was critically important in that legislation as well. I was saying to someone last evening, I remember the bill signing ceremony with President Clinton on February 9th, 1993, the very first act he signed into law as president, did not include Pat Schroeder in the Rose Garden ceremony. So every opportunity I get, I try to mention her again so that people will remember that you don't pass any legislation with one individual. A lot of people are involved, and Pat played a critical role. And it's just been interesting over the years. I started the Children's Caucus in the Senate with Pat Moynihan and Bob Dole. She's not here, but I shouldn't do this with all due respect. I'm glad that Ivanka Trump cares about this issue and is obviously articulate about the subject matter. But I think bipartisanship does get rewarded in Washington. I disagree with the point. I didn't introduce any legislation of any value whatsoever without a Republican partner in 30 years in the Senate. It takes more work. It takes leadership. And children's issues, we felt very importantly about this issue, but also all children's issues in terms of focusing on their needs. 1 out of 4 Americans fall into that category. They don't vote. They don't have political action committees. But in a sense, they needed to be represented at the table. And that had a lot to do with the genesis of the Family Medical Leave Act. So Rick and I have worked together, I mentioned earlier, on autism, Lyme disease were a couple of matters we wrote legislation on successfully. In fact, in autism, providing some care for caregivers, given the difficulty that where you're on the spectrum with autism, can be overwhelming for parents and issues, and realize the importance of that, of providing support for people to do that. So it was good to be invited, to be back at this discussion. You get moments in history that provide you an opportunity to do something meaningful, and you need to grab that moment when it occurs. And I'm glad to hear we're at sort of that moment here to expand this idea of being on unpaid leave. And my hope would be, and again, Rick and I will probably disagree on this, but I believe very strongly that medical leave should be a part of that. It's hard to understand why I would exclude that, given the tremendous difficulty that parents face, my colleagues faced in the Senate. I remember making the debate. I had colleagues who did wonderful things on behalf of their families. Remember Jake Garr, my good friend who I saw last week in Utah. We were a very close personal relationship despite differences. Jake gave a kidney to a daughter of his. Spent several weeks not in the Senate. He was applauded, obviously, by his colleagues and others for doing that courageous act for his daughter. And yet he was paid during the entire time. No one thought he was being negligent in his responsibilities as a senator at all. And so I often wonder, we certainly reward behavior where parents can take time with their children, not just at their birth, but also during critical times in their lives medically. And hopefully, again, we'll be able to come to some conclusion. I think the biggest argument we may have will be what Rick and I have already identified, and that's the pay for it. I think beyond that, I'm very optimistic about going beyond just parental care. So that's the reason I wanted to be here.
Thank you, sir. Senator?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And it's been a pleasure, really was a pleasure working with Chris in the United States Senate, the 2 bills we talked about, but other issues that we worked on. And I'm going to take a little issue with Chris just to side with Ivanka, not for partisan purposes, but I think Chris is right in the sense that when we were in the Senate, compromise was in fact rewarded. I'm not sure it is today, and so that's where I would differentiate. I think the political atmosphere has changed in the last 10 or so years, at least since I left the United States Senate, and so I think it is novel that we have an issue that is appearing, that is a controversial issue that conservatives and Republicans would have never seriously thought about, a national paid leave policy. As Chris and Adrian both kindly mentioned, I did oppose I voted against the Family Medical Leave Act. You didn't even know that I voted against it. I mean, so, and I did so because I was concerned about the impact on the business community, particularly the small business, and setting a precedent. But what I've seen over the past 25 years is a real fundamental shift in what's going on in families in this country and demographics in this country. And we have, I think conservatives are increasingly concerned about the state of, and this is what brings me to the table that maybe differentiates from Chris, is the state of newborns and the enormous amount of medical research that's now out there about the impact of parents not bonding with their children at this very young age and the devastating consequences of that for the long-term health of these children. And while a medical situation is urgent, and I understand the need, the long-term consequences are not necessarily as known as what we do know about the early childhood years. And so I look at it, and Chris is right, the issue is going to be resources. And there is going to be a struggle to get resources devoted to this. And so my input is going to be, we have ample evidence of, number one, the consequences of parents not bonding with their children. We have ample evidence that more and more people of childbearing age are not having children because of the expense and because of the disruption. And we have the lowest birth rates since the Great Depression in this country. And that is consequential to the economy of this country and to the fiscal health, not just in the long term, which I think Ivanka mentioned, which is social service programs like Social Security and Medicare. And I remind everybody, I have 7 children, so I've done my part for that. But most, you're welcome. But most are not because of the tremendous cost associated with it. And so there are ample reasons, given the limited resources that we're going to have, because it's going to be a struggle to get any resources to this program, given the limited resources, to diffuse it over a broader group of people makes it almost inconsequential to their lives. I'd rather take the limited resource we have and focus it on, admittedly, I mean, Chris, and I think Adrian or somebody here mentioned that 75% or something like that of FMLA is used on medical leave. Well, that actually proves my point, that actually a smaller group, more targeted, with limited resources, is actually going to have your biggest impact. And one of the things I learned in my final comment, I know I'm going long here, but my final comment is, one of the things that I have always admired about the Democrats, and it's caused me the bane of my existence of my conservative colleagues, is Democrats are willing to take a slice at a time and move on and fight again. Whereas Republicans want everything fixed at once, and if we can't get everything we want, we go no. I think this is an opportunity for Democrats to be Democrats, take the slice, and then fight another day.
Just quickly on this,
Yes,
on this last point, that the numbers I pointed earlier, that plus 70% that have taken the Family Medical Leave Act, that's 200 million examples of people taking the Family Medical Leave Act in 25 years. And the vast majority have done so for medical reasons. Sort of makes the case in a way. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have a medical or a parental leave program, what are the larger issues you're grappling with? Good Lord, when children are born, well, Ivanka was right. There's some 25% of women who are going back to work within 10 days of the delivery of a child. The problems that we're seeing with the sandwich generation, I'm a perfect example of this today. I have 2 daughters who are teenagers, and I've got 3 siblings who are not married and are sick. And I'm the primary caregiver, in a sense, financially and otherwise for them. It is difficult. They're in different locations, trying to provide for them. At the same time, I've got children running about. And so the point is, when you're getting that many problems in an aging generation or an aging population, you can't disregard that in terms of who takes care of people in those circumstances. So, again, my experience has been that when you get the kind of, I think, general agreement that we've now reached a point where paid leave is important, adding the fact that we want medical conditions to also be included, if you don't grab those moments to try to get it done, you can wait another half a generation to deal with it. So my hope is that we won't miss this opportunity. But just a point we can have the same agreement.
Well, one thing I'd add as we're on the topic of FMLA is that 50% of people say that they don't take FMLA because it doesn't have a paid component to it, which is part of the reason that this is driving the conversation. Anybody who's watching online, we ask you to submit questions, #VPC Live. Thank you for everybody who's adding them here. I have one more question for the two of you on my own, and then we'll jump to questions here. For generations, people have figured out how to balance work and family. And a lot of the criticism to a paid family leave proposal is that we should be able to figure it out. You should have personal responsibility. What makes you think that now might be the time, or what's driving this national interest for people to be elevating paid family leave as a potential solution that we need to tackle at the federal level?
Well, I think, again, you look at the state of the family today. The state of the family today is not what it was 25 years ago. And now you have a majority of children in America being raised without a father in the home. You have a lot more women in the workforce. I'd make the argument in large respects because of government policies that are both friendly, and which is a positive thing, but also punitive to families from a tax point of view. I mean, it's just much more expensive to live in America because of the tax burden that American families are dealt with, and so there are all sorts of, and just the whole culture, there's just a different culture of how when people get married, people are waiting longer and longer to get married. And I just look at it from the standpoint of a society that says, if we're going to continue, we need to have stable families for children to be raised in. We need parents to attach to their children. We need parents to have children if we're going to continue to be a civilization. One of the big arguments, in fact, one of the most effective arguments that the left has for immigration is that we're not replacing ourselves. And you can't have a growing economy and a vibrant economy with a declining population. It's a very hard thing to do. So there's all sorts of demographic reasons and social science and health science research that really do point to a need to rescue the family situation in America today that did not exist or didn't exist in such stark terms 25 years ago. And I think that's why at least I've found the easiest people to make the argument to on the conservative side of the aisle are faith-based and social conservative type groups, because they see the devastation of the family. They see the devastation that the children being raised in homes where there's a single mom and she can't connect, and the child's in daycare, and you see all this research about the importance of bonding, the importance of parents reading and vocabulary with their children, all these things that moms, single moms could do if they were home, but can't do because they're separated. And I think that is a very compelling case that, contrary to the question was asked earlier, why can't the private sector do this? Well, the answer is, I'd love the private sector to do this, but they're not doing it. And the evidence is pretty clear to the private sector. We had a couple of companies here who talked about the success of their programs providing paid family leave. I think the evidence is pretty clear that companies have done this, and you see around the world companies have done this for a long time, that this is a positive thing for companies to do, but they're not doing it. And I appreciate the benefit, the tax benefits that were included in the Omni. I appreciate all those things, but they're not going to get at the nut of the core problem, which is the vast majority of low-income single moms and not having the ability to connect to their children.
Well, again, there's no debate here about whether or not we ought to provide paid leave in a parental setting. I mean, I think that Rick has made a strong point, and I agree with him totally on that. As oftentimes happens, the country's way ahead of Washington on a lot of issues. We have the benefit now of states that are going ahead, not just the ones who have adopted family medical leave, but the ones who are considering it. If you take the ones considering it plus the states who have adopted it, you're getting near half the country. Done at a state level, the laboratories of states, Republicans and Democrats. The state of Washington was a Republican state senator that offered the legislation that created the bipartisan proposal there for family and medical leave, parental leave as well as the medical leave we talked about. And again, now some 6 or 7 states plus this city have adopted those plans. The state of California now more than a decade have had the benefit of how this is working. So we ought to be looking that way, it seems to me. There's a real danger in a sense. I mean, there's wonderful things to say, well, states are doing this, but you end up with a patchwork as well. In some states, there's the shared cost. In other states, it's totally borne by the employers. In others, it's totally borne by the employees. And you're getting patchworks along the way. We really need to have a consistent policy. You have a growing percentage of our population that are the so-called gig employees. That is, they don't work in the traditional settings that we did or people we represented did for years. They're independent contractors, for lack of a better description. They can't rely necessarily on a benevolent employer that wants this. They've got to rely on a national policy that will provide some of those issues as well. I think families are having fewer children today for a lot of different reasons. It isn't just cost. It's choices people are making as well about the size of the families they want to have. So again, I want to be optimistic. I had to be. I wouldn't have spent 9 years trying to get the unpaid leave program passed, and I had great support. When we finally passed the bill, I had over 70 members of the Senate that supported it. My principal co-sponsors all during the process. I don't want to get him in trouble now, but Dan Coates, when he was a senator in those days, was my lead co-sponsor along with Kit Bond and Arlen Specter and Jack Danforth and others. So it really was a bipartisan effort. And that was from the very beginning, by the way. It didn't come to that. We had vetoes and passing it in both houses every time, you may recall. But President Bush was vetoing it. I remember Jim Baker calling when he took over the campaign in August of 1992 and said, "Tell me again why we're opposed to family and medical leave." And I said, "Well, God, I've been asking John Sununu that question for the last 8 years." And so, in a sense, the country's way ready for this. They're already doing it at the state level. We need to catch up. This shouldn't take another 9 years to come around to this. If the debate is about a pay-for, we need to figure out how to do that in a sense that makes the most sense, has the least burden on people, and can be programmatically done without creating new agencies and new departments to do so. So I'm very optimistic about that. Again, having been through the long battle to get us to the point of an unpaid leave program. And with all the shortcomings in it, as I said, some 200 million cases in 25 years have benefited people. We've learned a lot from that. Let's pick up that evidence, if you will, bring it to this new debate. The fact that we've got an administration that cares about this issue on families, I applaud. I wish there were a broader consensus on a lot of these other questions involving children and families, but I'll take this as a victory so far. Now we just need to build on it.
This question is from John Rubin, and I'm sorry I can't read part of it, but I'm going to do my very best. People on both sides of the aisle share a common value of empowering hardworking Americans and their families. Why can't we seem to make progress on this topic?
Well, we are. I mean, again, as I think the fact that we're here today, as Rick pointed out, he was opposed to the bill back when he was in the House in those days, but has, like everything else, you have to be able to grow and see the needs that emerge, and I think that's encouraging as well. So I'm more optimistic about it. I heard Ivanka Trump say she was optimistic. And my hope is we can get something done. We've set a timeline for ourselves here to work on this thing. It won't be enough that Rick and I agree, or the Bipartisan Policy Commission. We need to come up with some ideas that a majority of the 535 people in the House and the Senate and the White House will agree on. So it's interesting to start here, but we have to be very mindful through the process that we're not the only audience, the people gathered in this room. And our job will be, in a sense, to design programs and be able to have a healthy dispassionate conversation, if you will, despite the passion around the issue itself. So I'm very hopeful that can happen.
Okay. Senator, I'm going to put this one to you. This is from Stacy Bridges. Are you here somewhere, Stacy? Perfect. Paid family leave goes against the GOP agenda, political agenda. How will we get Republicans to change policy and support paid family and medical leave?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what you do. You can say it goes against the GOP agenda. I mean, there were provisions in the omnibus that the Republicans passed that promoted companies from providing leave. So I think the GOP agenda is very much in favor of families, in favor of healthy children and stable families, and giving people the access to the workplace that's workable for them. So that gets into the structure of what we do and how it's going to be paid for. I mean, let's just deal with the reality that we have huge budget deficits, we have a huge entitlement state, and adding an additional entitlement at this point with, depending on how we pay for it, if we pay for it, is a huge question, and not one that it's probably going to be the most difficult thing that we deal with here. So I think the problem is the implementation, not the desire to actually do something about it. I think there's a great desire to do something. I think it's just a matter of how you would do it.
As we've been talking about paid family leave as part of the task force, we've been thinking about the impact on the private sector and what a national policy would do and the impact specifically on small businesses. I'd love to hear both of your takes, and Senator, a little bit of the history also with FMLA as you were passing it forward in that.
No, it's a great question because it comes up all the time. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce folks this morning talking about those issues. And that was a major concern. We had the debate, went on, as I said, many years. But the constant concern was this was going to be a huge burden on particularly smaller employers. And we've collected a lot of data now, and the benefit of that bill, granted unpaid leave, but nonetheless was worthwhile, that in fact the overwhelming majority of businesses after the implementation of the law, going back and asking whether or not, in fact, those concerns they expressed before the bill passed were borne out to become the fact. And overwhelmingly, including today, the studies that have been done in California, for instance, with the 10 years of paid leave program, in the 80% plus positive reaction to how it's working on things like attracting employees, retaining employees, productivity rates. There's an incredibly important list of business that you get with this program. It isn't just a benefit for the children and for the families. Businesses are benefiting from this program and idea. You only get less than 10% of the American people took on a yearly basis the unpaid leave. 90% of the American people, they're not anxious to have a reason to be away from work. No one wants to, having that sick child or a sick parent or themselves and have to avoid work. And 80% of people, as Rick has pointed out, and I think Ivanka did too, that lower income person that just never took 12 weeks. They'd be lucky to take a week or two if they could. But 12 weeks of unpaid leave would be impossible to do. So I'm more optimistic about this. Again, if you look at the data we're getting now, with the benefit of actually programs in place in diverse areas of our country, then we should benefit from that. Look at that data and information. And it ought to reduce some of the tension and opposition people feel about the benefits of this program, not just for families and children, but for our country as a whole.
Thank you, sir. Senator, did you want to add anything to that?
No, just to pick up on Chris, I just reiterate, I don't think, there certainly are some in the Republican Party who question the benefit of this. I'm not dismissing that. But I think what you're seeing is, and I give, again, the president credit for this, Ivanka credit for this, others of us who have been sort of working this issue a little bit, I think you're seeing a much more receptive understanding among conservatives that this is an issue that we need to deal with. It's all about the how, and it's all about the cost, and the cost and the how have consequences because you have unintended consequences of how you do things, and so that's going to be the sticky wicket here, and I can't, and it's not. It is not an easy problem to solve.
I want to underscore the point Rick's making. I never would have passed family medical leave 25 years ago if I didn't have more than half the Republican conference support it in the Senate. So 25 years
you're
ago.
going to have. I mean, you're going to have. I mean, the way the House, particularly the House, operates, you're going to have half the Republicans supporting this. So that's.
It didn't start out that way. I had to convince them.
I understand that.
Ultimately, when it came down to it, after all the hearings and all the debate we had, this was not a partisan issue at that point. And so I don't, in a sense, with all due respect to your question, I'm less worried about that. I think you have to address the questions that are being raised, much as we did 25 years ago, more than that, 35 years ago, in dealing with this. But I'm confident when you get the evidence, particularly what we're getting from the states and localities that are doing this, including things like Montgomery County, a neighbor community, not just states are doing this. So we're getting a lot of very, very valuable information about how this can work and what the costs are associated with a paid program.
With all due respect, FMLA, the experience there is great, but there were no federal resources involved. There were no taxes involved. It is a much, much, much harder climb.
But the arguments were roughly the same. And that is, again, this was too much of a burden on employers on the way.
I don't think that's going to be the issue this time. I really don't.
I'm looking at the chamber over here.
I don't think that's going to be the long pole in the tent.
Well, that's a step forward and helpful.
Well, we only have time for a couple more questions. So this one is from Sophia Giglio. I hope I said your name right. Sophia, are you here somewhere? Hi. We have two dads on stage. Do you see bipartisan support for a policy that would enable all kinds of parents to take leave, not just mothers?
Absolutely. I mean, this is hopefully the country has come to the point today where we don't have to debate those issues any longer. I know some have different views on the matter, but the country, the courts, and others, loving parents are not based on gender. So absolutely. There was no restriction. 25 years ago we passed the law. There were restrictions imposed by other means, but the law itself did not discriminate in any way. So we were even ahead of the curve back 25 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be. I would be surprised if the issue comes up that if they try to limit it to just a mother as opposed to a mother and a father. I mean, I don't see that as an issue.
Well, following your panel will be a great discussion with some academic experts who have some really great research and science that backs both of those things up. So I hope everybody sticks around and has a chance to listen to that too. But let me get to one last question while we have it. A significant percentage of families are headed by a female breadwinner. In fact, 40% of American households today are the female is the primary breadwinner. Those households take a bigger financial hit when they take unpaid or underpaid leave. And are you considering this as part of your review with the task force?
Well, I think it's one of the prime motivators for us to do this in the first place is the fact that you have a large number of single household families headed by women, as well as an increasing number of two household families headed by a woman, breadwinners. So that's one of the principal motivating factors for me and coming to the table on this. So yeah, I think that's very important.
Yeah, I'm sure Rick would add his own anecdotes. I know it's to personalize it to some extent, but I've often been asked, how did I get interested in the subject matter to begin with? I was single without any children at the time, and when I authored the legislation, I went through the process of it. Again, it was an experience at a church, at a mass on Sunday in East Haddam, Connecticut, where there was a woman in church with a child that was terribly disabled, very young. And after Mass, I went up and just started talking to her. And this child, as it turned out, Jacinta, wasn't supposed to live beyond the age of 3. Eva was a single mother trying to raise that child and working, and the difficulty she was having. Jacinta lived to be 23, had the same birthday. Still know Eva. She's remarried and has a growing family. But that experience of seeing what that woman in that little church on Sunday was going through radicalized me, if you want to, on the issue. That this person trying to raise a child with all the difficulties that child had, and that she needed the time to be with that child, but also needed to work in order to provide for the child. And as a society, haven't we reached a point where this shouldn't be a great conflict? And thank the Lord it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, this society of ours in the 21st century ought to be able to say, we're going to help you get over this difficulty, if you will, or to accommodate the needs you have for the life of that child along the way. So the history of that comes down to that meeting. That's where it all started for me, and that Mass in East Haddam, Connecticut, many, many years ago.
Well, Senators, thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of our task force. We really appreciate it. I hope everybody will stay and engage us as we move through this task force process and kind of come out the other side with recommendations. But thank you for your time. Thanks, sir. Good luck.